It seems like every time you turn on the news lately, it's global tensions rising and possibility of war looming,
Yeah.
And it's enough to make anyone wonder, are we really heading for another major conflict?
Right.
So today we are taking a deep dive into this complex world of geopolitics, economics, trying to figure out, is the threat real
Mm.
or is it just political noise?
Mm.
We've got some fascinating sources lined up, expert analysis of recent political events and economic data.
Okay.
We're going to look and see what's really happening beneath the surface, even zoom in on some companies like Rheinmetall
Uh-huh.
to understand how these trends impact the defense industry. And by the end of this, you'll have a much clearer view of the global landscape and how it might affect you, even if you never pick up a newspaper.
That's right. And I think what's particularly interesting right now is this feeling of uncertainty in Europe.
Yeah.
With the U.S. seemingly shifting its focus away from traditional alliances, European leaders are starting to worry about who will protect them if things get heated.
Yeah. I can see why they'd be nervous. We've all heard about the American umbrella,
Right.
the idea that the U.S. military would step in to defend Europe if needed. But what happens if that umbrella starts to shrink?
Well, for decades, Europeans have relied on that American protection, and it's allowed them to spend less on their own defense.
Right.
Americans spend roughly 3% of their GDP on defense.
Okay.
But for Europe to maintain a similar level of security on their own, it's estimated they'd need to spend closer to 5%.
Wow.
That's a huge jump, and it raises some serious questions about where that money would come from, especially given the current economic climate.
That makes sense. And it seems like every time we talk about the global economy these days, there's a lot of talk about uncertainty as well. Some experts are even saying we're on the brink of a recession. Is that something you're seeing in your analysis?
It's certainly a possibility. When we look at Germany, for example,
Okay.
their stock market is booming. The DAX index is at an all-time high. But at the same time, their actual GDP is shrinking, and they're struggling with persistent inflation despite interest rate cuts. This disconnect between the stock market and the real economy is a warning sign we're seeing in other parts of the world, too. It suggests that things might not be as stable as they appear.
So you're saying we shouldn't be reassured by a strong stock market because I think a lot of people, myself included, see a strong market as a good sign.
It's not that simple. While a strong stock market can reflect positive sentiment, it doesn't always tell the whole story.
For what?
We need to look beyond the headlines
Okay.
and examine the underlying economic fundamentals, things like GDP growth, inflation, and employment figures. Give us a much more accurate picture of the overall health of an economy.
Okay, so a strong stock market isn't necessarily a reason to celebrate,
Right.
and a shrinking GDP is a potential red flag.
Exactly.
What does all of this mean for the average person? Should we be worried?
I think awareness is key. Understanding the economic factors at play can help us make informed decisions about our own finances and investments. For example, if we see signs of a potential recession, it might be wise to be a bit more cautious with our spending.
That's a good point. So we've got rising global tensions, economic uncertainty, and the potential for increased defense spending in Europe.
Right.
Where does the defense industry fit into all of this?
Well, as you might expect, defense companies are seeing a surge in interest receiver. Investors are betting that this increased focus on security will translate into more government contracts and higher profits. We're seeing this play out with companies like Rheinmetall, a German defense contractor whose stock price has skyrocketed recently.
Wow.
They're expecting a significant jump in orders for their products, and investors are eager to get a piece of the action.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like investing in defense stocks might be a good idea right now.
Not so fast.
Oh.
While there's certainly potential for growth in the defense sector,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that these stocks are inherently risky. Their success is directly tied to geopolitical events, which are notoriously unpredictable. And in Rheinmetall's case, their current stock price is based on the assumption that they'll secure massive orders from all over Europe.
Okay.
If those orders don't materialize, their stock could plummet.
So it's a gamble.
It is.
And it makes me wonder, are we really on the brink of another major war?
That's the million-dollar question. The current situation is complex.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of factors at play. But one thing is for sure, the old ways of financing global power are being challenged.
Okay.
Governments are facing tough choices about how to allocate resources, and those choices will have major implications for the global economy and international relations.
Speaking of history repeating itself, There are some interesting parallels between what's happening today
Uh-huh.
and what happened back in the 1960s when France decided to leave NATO.
Right.
Could you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, decided to withdraw from NATO's military command structure
Yeah.
because they felt that American control over nuclear weapons development left them vulnerable. They essentially wanted the ability to defend themselves independently, including with their own nuclear arsenal.
So they didn't want to rely on the American umbrella any longer.
Right.
I see the connection to what's happening now with European countries potentially feeling like they need to take their own defense more seriously.
Yeah.
But does this mean they're all going to start developing nuclear weapons?
That's unlikely. Today, France remains the only EU country with nuclear capabilities.
Okay.
The UK also has nuclear weapons,
Right.
but they are no longer part of the EU.
Right.
However, this raises a critical question for the listener to consider.
Okay.
In a world where Russia, China, Pakistan, and India all possess nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
how can Europe ensure its own security in the long term?
That's a really good question, and it leads to another point we've touched on, the financial side of things.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that governments traditionally fund their spending through things like bonds, but that's becoming more challenging. Why is that?
Well, think of it like this many countries are already carrying a lot of debt.
Okay.
And when interest rates rise, like they have been recently, borrowing more money becomes even more expensive. It's like trying to pay off a high-interest credit card. It's not sustainable in the long run.
Yeah.
So if European countries do decide to ramp up their defense budgets, they'll need to find creative ways to finance it.
So where could that money possibly come from? And what does this mean for the global economy as a whole?
That's a question a lot of economists are grappling with right now. It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications. One possibility is that governments might have to cut spending in other areas.
Like what?
Like social programs or infrastructure projects to free up funds for defense. Another possibility is that they'll need to raise taxes,
Okay.
which could potentially slow down economic growth. And then there's the wild card China.
Ah, yes, China.
Okay.
We've talked about Europe and the U.S., but where does China fit into this global power puzzle?
China's role is absolutely crucial. While President Xi Jinping has been relatively restrained in response to things like trade tensions with the U.S.,
Right.
he holds significant leverage, especially over major American companies like Apple and Tesla
Yeah.
that rely on Chinese manufacturing.
So he could use that leverage
Mm-hmm.
to exert pressure on the U.S. and to potentially tip the scales in this whole power dynamic.
Exactly. And there are signs that Xi Jinping might be shifting his strategy.
Oh, really?
Remember the meeting he had recently with Chinese business leaders, including Jack Ma of Alibaba?
Yeah.
That was a pretty clear signal that China is prepared to use its economic power to counter U.S. influence on the global stage. It's a high-stakes game of chess, and everyone is watching to see what the next move will be.
Okay, so we've got economic uncertainty, shifting alliances, and China potentially playing a more assertive role.
Right.
Sounds like a recipe for conflict,
Right.
but I keep hearing people say that nobody actually wants a war. Is it possible that all of this tension is just posturing away for countries to flex their muscles without actually engaging in a full-blown conflict?
It's certainly possible. There's a lot of bluffing and strategic maneuvering happening on the international stage. Nobody wants a war, especially a large-scale conflict that could involve nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these power dynamics are real and the stakes are incredibly high.
So how do we make sense of all of this? Is there a way to predict what might happen next, or are we just along for the ride?
It's impossible to predict the future with certainty, especially when it comes to geopolitics. But what we can do is look for patterns, analyze trends, and try to understand the motivations of the key players. And one thing that's becoming increasingly clear is that the old models of global power are breaking down.
What do you mean by that?
For decades, the world has operated under a system where military might and economic dominance were the primary currencies of power. But as we've been discussing, those traditional levers of power are becoming more expensive and less effective in the face of new challenges.
So if military might and economic dominance aren't enough anymore, what are the new currencies of power?
That's the big question, isn't it? Will it be control of key technologies like artificial intelligence and cyber warfare? Will it be the ability to control the flow of information and shape public opinion? Or will it be something entirely new that we haven't even imagined yet?
It's fascinating, a little bit scary to think about.
Yeah.
But I do remember you mentioning France leaving NATO back in the 60s and how that might be a lesson for other countries today.
Right.
Could you explain that a little more?
Sure. France's decision to withdraw from NATO's military command wasn't just about nuclear weapons. It was about asserting their independence
No.
and carving out their own path on the world stage. They didn't want to be just another pawn in someone else's game. They wanted to be a player in their own right.
So they weren't content to just rely on the American umbrella. They wanted to take control of their own destiny.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful lesson for other countries today, especially those in Europe.
Yeah.
They can't just rely on the U.S. for protection anymore. They need to think strategically about their own interests and develop their own sources of power.
So in a way, it's not just about tanks and missiles. It's about redefining what power even means in the 21st century.
Absolutely. We're living through a period of profound transformation, and the rules of the game are being rewritten as we speak. The old assumptions about military might and economic dominance are no longer enough. We need to think differently about how we build influence, how we secure our interests, and how we shape the world around us.
So what does this all mean for the average person? Should we be stocking up on canned goods and building bunkers in our backyards?
I don't think we need to go that far.
Okay.
But it is important to be aware of these trends and to think critically about the information we're consuming. Don't just blindly accept what you see on the news or read on social media.
Do your own research, ask questions, and form your own opinions.
So it's about being informed and engaged citizens, not just passive consumers of information.
Exactly. The world is becoming increasingly complex, and it's more important than ever to be able to cut through the noise and understand the forces that are shaping our lives.
That makes sense. But it can also feel overwhelming. What are some practical things people can do to stay ahead of the curve and make sense of this rapidly changing world?
Well, first and foremost, I would say stay curious. Don't just accept the narratives you're given. Dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge assumptions.
It's like being a detective looking for clues and piecing together the bigger picture.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to look beyond the mainstream media, seek out diverse perspectives, read independent analysts, and listen to podcasts like this one. The more information you have, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about the forces shaping the world, the better you'll be able to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of community. Connect with others who share your interests, engage in constructive dialogue, and work together to build a better future.
It's like that old saying, 2 heads are better than 1. We can achieve so much more when we work together.
And finally, don't lose hope. Despite all the challenges we've discussed today, there's still so much to be optimistic about. Human ingenuity and resilience have always found a way to overcome adversity.
It's like that quote from Winston Churchill. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
We have the tools, we have the knowledge, and we have each other. So let's go out there and build a future that's worthy of our highest aspirations.
It feels like we're all standing at a crossroads.
Yeah.
You know, facing a future full of possibilities.
Yeah.
Both exciting and a little bit daunting. Makes me think about those choose-your-own-adventure books, where the ending depends on the decisions you make along the way.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that we're not just passive observers in this global drama.
Right.
Our individual choices, actions, and ideas all contribute to shaping the future.
So we've talked about a lot of complex issues today, from shifting power dynamics and economic uncertainties to the potential for new forms of power emerging.
Right.
Where do we even go from here? What are some things our listeners can do to stay ahead of the curve and make sense of this rapidly changing world?
I think it all comes back to staying informed, engaged, and adaptable. Remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about the forces shaping the world, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
So don't just bury your head in the sand and hope for the best.
Exactly. Stay curious, ask questions, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions. Don't be afraid to seek out diverse perspectives and engage in thoughtful conversations with people who might hold different views than your own.
It's like expanding your horizons and seeing the world through different lenses.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And remember, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we actively create through our choices and actions.
So we've got a lot to think about. What's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with from this deep dive?
I'd say the world is in a state of flux, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
Change can be unsettling, but it also creates opportunities for growth, innovation, and progress. The key is to approach it with a mindset of curiosity, courage, and a willingness to adapt.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of global power dynamics, economics, and the future that lies ahead.
Yeah.
I know we covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of the forces shaping our world and a renewed sense of agency in shaping your own future.
It's been a pleasure discussing these important issues with you, and to our listeners, remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. We're all in this together, and the future is ours to create.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.